So, background extinction, as long as it's not too elevated an extinction rate and it's spread across all the organisms of an ecosystem, it's a healthy, natural thing. And we typically think of extinction as a bad thing, and although obviously for the species involved it's a bad thing, and for us as we watch it might be a sad thing, as long as the rates are not too elevated, it just keeps ecosystems fresh and turning over. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. So we talked about cataclysms, which we'll come back to. We talked about focused extinction events, where we have one group of organisms that is disproportionately being impacted by an extinction event. And those are much more cause for concern. Another cause for concern are areas with high levels of endemism. So let's define endemism and compare it to when we say that a organism is native to an area. So endemism is where we find an organism and nowhere else on the globe. So for instance, there are many species that are endemic to the coastal region of California. They can be found there and nowhere else on Earth. There are not very many species that are endemic to South Texas. They may extend all the way down into Mexico, some of the more subtropical ones, and others extend. There are a few. But Texas has a lower rate of endemism for the same area than California. And that's because of geology, the way the oceans are, and these unique habitats that separate California and make it very different ecologically from the rest of the areas near it. Okay, so the tacuache, right, which is the Spanish word for possum, sometimes called the Virginia possum, is native to South Texas. It's here naturally. Humans didn't bring it in. It's always, for a very long time, it's been here. However, it is not endemic to South Texas. It ranges all the way up into the eastern United States and all the way down into South America. So, although it is native, it is not endemic. Now, if we have a small concentrated area of endemism, then that is going to be more susceptible and more problematic if we have environmental change. And islands, we've got New Caledonia, we've got the Philippines, Borneo. Islands tend to have very, very high levels of endemism. The Galapagos Islands here off the coast of Ecuador is one famous example of that from an evolutionary perspective. When Darwin got there, he noticed that there were new animals that he had never seen before. And although they looked somewhat similar to animals from the mainland, they were endemic just to those islands. Okay? So just remember that's a good vocabulary word you need to know. Now, oftentimes, changes to an ecosystem are very, very unpredictable. Ecosystems are very complicated and interconnected networks, and so it can be tricky to understand what will happen if we remove one species, one component of that ecosystem. Or if we add a new one, sometimes it can have vast and often unintended consequences. So let's just look at one example. This is an example from the Catalina Islands, which are off the coast of California. Now, humans brought pigs to the island as livestock, and some of them escaped and became feral. That's a very common thing. In fact, feral pigs are now very common in many, many parts of the world, including South Texas, and they often have a huge impact on the ecosystem. But on the island, it was a little bit unpredictable and different than in other areas. So the pigs got on the island, they became a feral, and eagles, which were very infrequent visitors to these islands, they were several miles off the coast, the eagles have to fly all out. They very rarely would go because there wasn't a lot of food for them. But once the pigs became established, suddenly there's lots of food. And so then they began to establish populations there. They eat not only the pigs, but they eat other animals, including foxes. And foxes, which are the primary predator, and foxes are active in the day and the night, but they're primary predator of the skunks, which were kept in check by this big fox population. But as eagles start eating the foxes, the skunks just have this explosion, and skunks don't get taken by eagles very often, primarily because they're nocturnal, but I don't know, maybe their scent glands might have something to do with prey choice for those eagles. But you would have never predicted at the outset, said, hey, don't let these pigs escape on this island, because if you do, we'll have way, way, way too many skunks. You're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. What do skunks and pigs have to do with one another? And so this just shows you some of these unpredictable, crazy interactions that can occur. So when humans bring in a new species, it might directly compete with other species. It might indirectly compete with them. It might have an impact on a wide range of species, but through many, many different ecological connections. So just be aware that ecosystems are complicated, and we can't predict, like if you bring in X animal or remove Y animal, what the outcome will be. And so we try to be very, very careful. We'll try to do experiments if people want to introduce an animal for biocontrol or some other thing. They'll do many, many experiments to try and get the best data to determine whether or not it will have a disproportional impact on that ecosystem. But even with all those experiments, all that data, often when this species is introduced, it is very unpredictable. So let's look at an exception to this rule of background extinction. This is with disease. So this is a very famous example. It's been important over the last couple decades, and this is a disease called chytridiomycosis. You don't need to know the name of that. It's caused by a fungus. And this is a fungal infection that disproportionately impacts amphibians. And you can look it up, but there are many, many areas and many species of frogs that have been just severely impacted by this fungus. And entire species, sometimes many, many species in the same areas, have gone extinct as this fungus has raged through these frog populations. Now, that's a worrisome and an important trend right now amongst amphibians. And people are working on trying to save them and put them into fungus-free areas, and then perhaps they can repopulate once the fungus goes away or once we figure out how to treat it. And although this is a kind of an extreme example, this happens all the time in many species. In fact, it happens even in our own species sometimes. We like to watch these shows, TV shows and movies, these zombie apocalypse stories that are basically about a huge plague that comes in, and I guess it's a living death plague, so there's a little bit more added drama and action there. But this is not really the zombie part is, but the plague part is really not fictional. It just has been a long time. Now, we're in the middle of this COVID-19 thing right now, but in the long scheme of things, humans will come through this. It's going to be a bit of an impact immediately. It's bigger, it's wider and more serious than any plague or any infection that we've had in the last 100 years or so. But we'll get through it, right? We're not going to have the middle of The Walking Dead. But historically, there have been some massive, massive pandemics that have had a huge impact on the globe. This was taken from National Geographic back, it's been about 8 years ago, when there was an Ebola outbreak, and they were trying to compare it. So the Ebola outbreak at the time, which had killed nearly 5,000 people, is down here, this little tiny red dot in the corner. All these other dots represent other historical plagues. So this is the plague of Justinian, which is estimated to have killed 100 million people. And that's at a time when global populations were not anywhere near the size they are today. This is the Black Plague, which killed 50 million people. This is the flu pandemic from 1919. So there are some very, very serious ones. And other ones that we don't have in the historical record proportionally may have been even more serious and nearly wiped out the human race. This is an image of a painting from 1348 to 1350, which were these 3 plague years when the Black Plague, the bubonic plague caused by a bacterium that was transmitted by fleas on rats, killed nearly 50% of some areas of the world. Imagine 50% of people being gone just within 3 years. This had a massive impact on history. The Justinian plague, which was even larger, although we don't have quite as good records, was back in the Roman era, 541 to 542 Common Era. So these are massive plagues, and although our modern technology allows us to alleviate and perhaps make them not as serious, it's still possible, as COVID-19 has demonstrated, to have very, very serious plagues. And so we keep an eye on this, and we try to look at trends and try to predict ahead. We didn't do a very good job with this one, but to some extent these sorts of things are by their very nature a little bit unpredictable. So just be aware that plagues can play a major role, can cause extinctions. You don't need to worry about COVID-19 causing the human race to go extinct. but it is having a major impact on our species. In other areas, we have trends that have come in and have wiped out entire groups of endemic species. Each of these 5 birds in this image here are now extinct, and they were found only on the Hawaiian Islands, many of them just on one island. And they were pushed to extinction because of humans. Sometimes humans inadvertently bring in a competitor or inadvertently bring in a predator. Other times it's environmental change, cutting down rainforests or building condominiums. If we do that enough, these organisms run out of ecological space. And Hawaii is a very, very important area because it is the most remote of any large island system. If you look at Hawaii, it's basically smack dab in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, the Pacific Ocean. And so because of that, when something made it there, it often had the run of the place. So the early plants that got there diversified and filled up many, many niches because it was tricky for plants to get there, and birds got there, and then other things got there. Crickets and fruit flies are entirely unique, and they're entire species complexes that are found only on the Hawaiian Islands and nowhere else. So when these guys go extinct, it's forever. If you have an organism that's found widespread across North America and it goes extinct in Virginia, that's not that big of a deal. It's important for Virginia, but if it's still found in many other areas, it's not a big deal. But for narrow endemic ranges, like of necessity on these islands, it's a serious thing. And so although predation, competition from other species, disease, global environment, all of these things might play a role, the big overarching reason why each of these species and all of the others that went extinct was because of failure to adapt to a changing environment. And humans are one of the big changes now.